Hi everyone, my name is Matt Williams. I teach at the University of Oxford and I'm going to tell you the top 5 thinking skills tricks that I teach to my undergraduate students here at the university. The reason for learning these, if you want to, is that they will make you more competitive if you're applying to universities like Oxford. They'll make you more capable if you're already at university, and they can help you solve all sorts of problems, not just academic ones. So they're fundamental skills that are really worth learning. And I think an important thing to focus on at the start is that they are skills. And skills, as with any type of skill, whether it's cooking skills, dancing skills, sports skills, can be perfected and improved. One thing that a lot of people assume, wrongly, is that thinking skills are sort of a fixed entity that you're born with. You have this natural disposition towards intelligence, greatness, genius, whatever word you want to use, and that's completely unalterable until you die. And the reason we think in these terms is because of IQ, the intelligence quotient. Now, that is highly problematic. There's loads of evidence to show that you can augment, you can enhance your thinking skills, that genetics does play a role in our problem solving and critical thinking abilities, but it's actually a much smaller role than many people assume, and there's a huge capacity for individuals to change and improve their thinking skills. So please don't sort of ever say no to yourself, ever give up along the lines of, well, I can't do this because I'm not clever enough. You can. If you want those skills, just as if you wanted to be a better dancer, if you wanted to be a better cook, you could, in all likelihood, develop those capabilities. So it's more a question of aspiring to them and being committed and working towards them, as opposed to sort of wondering whether or not you've been gifted with these particular capabilities. Okay? So let's start at the beginning with thinking about your thinking skills. So my first tip to all of my students is to indulge in a little bit of what's called metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. If cognition is thinking, then metacognition is thinking about your thinking. It's quite a strange business, right? If you even sort of stop and just think about what's going through your mind right now, it's going to be loads of stuff. There's going to be all sorts of rich layers of different thoughts and ideas, some in sequence, some in parallel, some in just a big old sort of tangled mess. And it's beautiful and incredible to observe the brain at work, if you can do such a thing with your own mind. But I would encourage you to just take stock every now and then and think about what you're thinking about. Now there is a utility to this, because when you start to audit the way your brain works, you can start to enhance certain elements of it, you can enhance certain capabilities. So a good place to start is with a bit of a test, just to see how your brain solves particular problems. And this test very closely aligns with the sort of puzzles that we offer students at Oxford University interviews. We interview all prospective students at the university, and so this is a test to see how you would solve these sorts of problems. What I've got on the screen is a very familiar image, the United States flag, and what I would ask a student is to simply make some observations about this flag to tell me what they see. Okay? Now, what is typical is that people assume that I'm looking for a certain stock of knowledge. They assume that I want them to know certain facts about the flag. But what I really want them to do is to make observations, to tell me what they see. I'm interested in them as an individual. The issue is that a lot of people's thinking skills are derivative. They aren't their own, they're coming from somebody else. So, for example, when I show people this image, they commonly say, well, the flag has 50 stars, because they've been told that. Or the flag has 13 stripes, again, because they've been told that. It's not likely that in the time I've allotted to them, they have made that observation on their own. So it's not their own unique original observation, it is entirely derivative. And this is a bit of a problem, that a lot of the phenomena that we encounter in our lives, we are looking at through somebody else's eyes, because someone's told us, oh, well, you should know that this flag has 50 stars. And that's something you ought to recall whenever someone asks you to say something about the American flag. It's a factoid that we are almost automatically sort of conditioned to trot out on cue. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's correct, but it's also not original. And what we're looking for are people that can solve problems creatively, independently, for themselves. That's ultimately what I'm training my students to do. I'm not training them to have a stock of knowledge that they will be able to utilize and deploy at any given moment. I'm giving them the skills to solve any problem, including problems I couldn't even possibly imagine, and to do so authentically for themselves. Okay? So one thing to think about is how to ensure that they are your own thoughts at all, whether your brain is actually working for you or whether your brain is faithfully repeating what somebody else says or thinks. Now, one neat trick to try and ensure that you are thinking for yourself is to be much more childish in your thought processes, to think in the way that a young child, like a toddler, would think. The beautiful thing about the way toddlers' minds work is that they are unencumbered, to be blunt, with much knowledge. So they are not able to take anything in the world for granted, and they ask such tremendously inquisitive and perceptive questions. You'll know this from your own experience. You might remember it yourself when you were a young child. You might have younger siblings or relatives or family friends that are like this. Why is the sky blue? Why is gold yellow when most other metals are silver? Do mobile phones get heavier when you take photos with them? Those are the sorts of mind-bending questions that young children ask because they don't feel embarrassed or ashamed about being curious of these things, and they can't take anything for granted, and they don't have the knowledge to just simply trot out something that they think people want to hear when it comes to assessing or analysing the world around them. So what you should do is then look again at things like this American flag and imagine you've never seen it in your life before and behave as if you're a toddler again. I actually spend a remarkable amount of my time teaching at Oxford University my students to regress back to a sort of childish wonder of this capacity to notice the enormous and incredible detail of the universe and the world around them, even in things that are so familiar to them that they've lapsed into the banal, into the sort of mundane, to reconnect with their absolutely extraordinary wonder. So, a toddler, when confronted with the American flag, would probably start off with all sorts of absolutely foundational questions. What is it? Why do we need one? Oh, it's brilliant. Most people don't even get that far in their analysis. Then toddlers would ask about the shape. Why is it that those proportions? Why is there a blue rectangle in the top left corner? Why is that rectangle full of pointy things? And why are those pointy things said to be stars? Because stars don't seem to look like that in the night sky. And why do those pointy things have 5 points in particular? And why is there stripes? And why are the stripes horizontal rather than vertical? And. Now, what we're doing in asking all of those questions is we're actually analysing a problem. We're breaking it down into sub-problems so that we can deal with them in turn. And this is a tremendously useful skill. But perhaps the most important part of the skill is that we are making observations for ourselves. We are actually looking at the flag. We're not looking at it through somebody else's eyes. We're not allowing someone else's cognition to dominate. We are finally utilising our own cognition. And honestly, it takes a few years for my undergraduates to fully grasp this because many of them don't feel they have the license. They don't feel like they're allowed to truly think for themselves. So it's not because they are unintelligent. Remember what I said earlier, this is not about whether or not people are born geniuses or not, because such things are kind of irrelevant. What we're talking about is just the capacity and the willingness to speak for yourself. And young children are so much more enabled, they feel much more confident in doing so than adults do. So I would strongly recommend that you think about how you think and you make sure that you are in fact thinking for yourself. And the solution to doing so is to be a lot more childish. Another thing related to this is the pace of your thinking. You need to slow down. Okay, this is, of course, me now being derivative of a very famous and fantastic work by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, wherein, amidst a great sort of degree of complexity and sophistication that I'm absolutely going to undermine in the next few minutes, he describes the distinction between System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is much more intuitive, effortless, it's automatic. System 2 is slow, deliberate, difficult, taxing, quite sort of complicated and hard to do. And what I would encourage my students to do is to very much engage System 2. So when I showed you the American flag, System 1 was likely to have initially taken hold. And that's when people start to say, it's got 50 stars, it's got 13 stripes. They're not thinking, they're not making an effort. They're just automatically regurgitating some factoids that somebody else has told them. System 2 thought is what children tend to engage in because, again, they don't have that stock of knowledge that they can just reach into and pull out. So their pace of thinking is much slower. There's a common misconception, which is that Oxford students are incredibly quick-witted and fast. And to a certain extent that's true, but that's only because they've trained themselves to think more slowly. It's a bit paradoxical, but you have to get used to doing things much more slowly. Just as anyone who has a terrific skill would have to train in the skill over and over again, often starting with a slow pace before they can start going faster and faster and faster. So you've got to get used to thinking more slowly. In, for example, an Oxford interview, if a student just sort of blurts out an automatic answer to one of my complex questions, I'll just ask it to them again, and I'll ask them to sort of inquire about specific details, and I'll push them to go deeper and deeper. And what I'm doing is I'm encouraging them to slow down, and I'm encouraging them to slow the pace of their thinking. And actually, pace here can also helpfully describe an acronym, which is that by all means play to your strengths. When you are trying to analyse a problem, you probably have certain strengths already, so pay attention to those. You might have some particular skills in, let's say, physics. So if you are good at analysing problems as a physicist, then great. There's nothing to be disparaging about that. That's a strength that you should be aware of. But you should be aware of it, and that's the A. You must acknowledge what your strengths are, and perhaps therefore where your limitations lie as well. C stands for creativity. Creativity comes through attention to detail. If you want to be a more creative, more original thinker, you need to have an eye for detail. The sort of person that looks at an American flag and just notices it's got stars and stripes is not creative, because they're not paying attention to the details. Someone that says, well, isn't it interesting that the American flag has 5 pointed stars? Well, that's someone who's already elevating their thought into a much more original, independent plane, because they are starting to notice the specific details. They're not glossing over them, they're getting right into the weeds, and that's where creativity tends to come from. And finally, E is that you should examine alternatives to your way of thinking. Once you've come up with a particular conclusion, think about what you're not thinking about. I know that's sort of slightly impossible, but in the sense of where are there gaps in your cognition? Where are there things that you're perhaps not considering? Perhaps you can anticipate what others will be thinking when they're analysing the same problem, and you should think about why you don't accept those as the best explanation. So we can try again with another sort of quite banal object, in this case a bowl of salad. So remember, play to your strengths. When you look at this bowl of salad, what sorts of things tend to come to your mind? For some people, let's say those who are skilled in physics, they might be thinking about colour. They might be thinking about the matter of the glass, right? And the nature of the different vegetables in terms of their matter, their orientation, and so on. And that's great, right? There's nothing to be ashamed of with that, but be aware of that. So if you are looking at this problem through the eyes of a physicist, what are you perhaps not paying closer attention to? Maybe you're not so interested or attentive to the aesthetics of it, how the vegetables have been arranged in order to try and look beautiful. Maybe you're not, therefore, thinking very deeply about what beauty means or why this bowl of salad might look attractive to some people. That's another way of analysing this problem that if we allow ourselves to slow down, we might be more likely to notice. Okay, and then creativity comes through an eye to detail, trying to really unpack the whole image, not just sort of saying, oh, it's a bowl of salad, but really trying to sort of figure out what's going on and why it's in this orientation. Okay, and then finally examine the alternatives. Once you've come up with some ideas that you think are interesting about this image, then try and work out some alternative explanations, some alternative interpretations of the image, and see what you think of those as well. Now, I'm deliberately choosing an image which is almost offensively dull, right? It's a bowl of salad. But that's because, if you engage your childish mind, if you slow down your thinking, you actually start to notice wonder everywhere. You start to notice just the beauty and the complexity of reality is within an arm's reach at all times of our life. And that is so powerful, because the minute we start respecting the complexity and the wonder of the universe around us is the minute we can start to take more control over it. In other words, and conversely, if you start to get easily bored of the complexities of reality, then you're not going to take any control over it. You're just going to be beset by it. You're going to be controlled by it. So really slow down your thinking, take a bit more time and effort over analysing problems, and you'll analyse them better, to be honest. Okay? So what's my next tip? Well, tip number 3 is to improve your memory. Now again, memory skills are skills that can be improved. there's all sorts of evidence to corroborate this. London taxi drivers, for example, that drive the black taxis in the city of London, have to learn all of the streets, and there's tens of thousands of streets in not just the city of London, but Greater London as well. And there have been observations of their brain literally growing as a consequence of this, and in particular the hippocampus, which is the part of our brains that regulates memory. So we can observe people growing, engorging their brains, as if it's a muscle that's growing through greater use. So again, going back to my earlier point about whether or not you are a genius is totally irrelevant. The question for you is, do you want the skills or not? If you don't want the skills, that's fine. But don't ever say to yourself, I don't have a choice, because that's most likely not the case, okay? So why would you even want to improve your memory? Well, fairly obviously it can help you recall ideas. But of course that seems to fly in the face of what I was previously saying, which is that we don't necessarily want this big stock of knowledge that we can then just trot out in a really derivative, automatic, unthinking way. Well, actually, the utility of a good memory is that, yes, sure, you can have lots of facts, you can have lots of knowledge, but it can also help you have all sorts of different frameworks for solving problems. You can have lots of different ways of viewing the same idea, the same problem. And that can be very helpful. So that when you do slow your brain down, you actually have a greater variety of different things you can resort to. And actually there are all sorts of memory techniques that you can use. The one that I'm showing here involves assigning an object to numbers, and so that when you then try and remember a list of things, you can tell a story between the object and the thing that needs to be remembered. So the example I've given here is that, say, the number 1 is a stick, the number 2 is a swan or a duck, the number 3 is an apple, and so on. And let's say you've got to remember a shopping list. So one of the items on your shopping list is a bag of flour. Let's say it's the first on your list. You can imagine a story of someone smacking a bag of flour with a stick. So now you've got that story connection between the stick and the flour, and you've got number 1 sort of embedded in your mind. The amazing sort of power of this technique is that you can remember lists of extraordinary length, and once you've told those stories in your mind, you'll not only remember the lists, you'll also remember the order, and you'll remember it for as long as you need to until you repopulate the list with new stories. Honestly, this is one of the most useful skills I have ever learnt in my whole life. I've used it to memorize lectures, speeches, I've used it to memorize books. It's so powerful. When it comes to things like revision or any other sort of skill like that, it is magnificently useful. Now, I'm not going into sufficient detail here to be particularly helpful to you, but what I would recommend is that there are lots of videos on YouTube that will help develop your memory skills. And all I would suggest is that you invest the hour or so it would take to learn one of those techniques properly, so that you too can improve your memory, because it will make you a much more powerful thinker. Okay, and here's an example of how it can be used, for example, to memorize the soliloquy, the to be or not to be soliloquy from Hamlet. Okay, so what I've done here is that the first 10 lines I've assigned with numbers, and again what you would do is you would remember or come up with a story to connect the item that is represented by the numbers with something that you think is a primary feature of that line, and you can very quickly memorize entire plays with this technique. Okay, so what's next? Well, number 4 is fail better. The crucial thing to remember is that people don't succeed without failure, that failure is a fundamental part of improving your skills. You know, one of the things that people get quite frustrated about when they're trying to get a job is that they're told they can't get that job without experience. Well, let's unpack that a bit. What is experience? And why is it so valuable to certain jobs? Experience is basically a litany of failures, right? Usually not particularly serious failures, but small little mistakes. And that's experience, because then when you take on a new job, you don't have to go through all of those mistakes again, because you can anticipate them and you can go forward. Well, that's basically what life is, right? That's what we do as we grow up. But there's also this sort of extraordinary narrative around failure, that it's something that is completely appalling, it ought to be avoided at all costs, you're a loser if you're a failure, you know, all these sorts of totally awful connections and connotations of the word. And that's ridiculous because failure is unavoidable. And the very attempt to avoid failure will ironically lead to the most catastrophic of failures, because people that are so scared of failing will not try to achieve anything. So we've got to be much kinder to ourselves. Failure is unavoidable, okay? And therefore nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to be scared of, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to grow and to become stronger. But this does require a degree of self-care. And this is about our thinking skills, because we need to be willing to think through things that could end up being challenged, that could end up leading to a mistake or a problem or indeed a failure. And that, provided that it doesn't do someone any harm, is fine, right? So we need to be a lot better as a species at failing and not thinking of it as such a big deal. And there are other elements to this sort of self-care idea, which is that we need to look after our bodies, because the performance of your mind, of your cognition, is of course a function of the health of your body. So if you're not eating terribly nutritious food, if you're not drinking enough water, and if you're not sleeping sufficiently well, then your cognition will be instantly impaired. So you do need to be very careful with how you look after yourself physiologically if you intend to have the most high-performing brain that you might like. We also, as mentioned on several occasions, just need to be more childish and not sort of be disparaging of that. Being childish is not the same as being immature. Being childish is the same as being perceptive, creative, committed, curious, right? These are fantastic things to be. These are not weaknesses, and we need to indulge in that. We should also allow ourselves the occasional flight of fancy, the occasional daydream. Albert Einstein had some of his strongest revelations about the theories of relativity when he had a daydream about flying along on a light wave and imagining what that might do. So, try to force your brain constantly to be attentive and focused could go against its own inclinations, and that could actually be quite damaging and unhealthy. It does need rest on occasions, and that's not a weakness. That's something that could help it freshen up. And occasionally, if you allow yourself to just wander and explore somewhat off the beaten path, you might find things that are much more invigorating and powerful if you're trying to solve a problem, rather than just constantly going back to the problem and seeing if you'll solve it by banging your head against the wall again and again. Okay? So have a think about those things. Finally, it's important to chase wonder rather than glory. A lot of people aspire to places at universities like Oxford because they want to rub it in someone else's face. They want to sort of show themselves to have attained the highest heights of academic prestige. To be blunt, that was exactly why I wanted to come to Oxford in the first place. And I realised very quickly thereafter that that was a complete mistake, that I shouldn't have been aspiring to Oxford to say, I go to Oxford, now back off, leave me alone. I should have been aspiring to go to Oxford because it's such an incredible place for exploring the world and the universe. And that ultimately is what I really love. I don't love showing off. I don't love telling people that I study at Oxford. I love sharing ideas with them. I love thinking through problems. And that's what I should have been driving towards my whole life. And that would have made all sorts of things like failure much more palatable, because failure, of course, if you're seeking glory, will be particularly hard. But if you're seeking wonder, then a knockback just means that you have to try a new idea, and it's kind of innocuous and unimportant. But the bottom line is that we need to be a lot better at failing. Okay? The final study skill, which I think is fundamental, is making plans. Of course, the famous adage is that if you fail to plan, you should plan to fail. And this is fundamentally true. Pretty much every aspect of what you might be doing with regards to your thinking would be enhanced if you planned it, if you thought more strategically, if you thought in a more long-term fashion. The classic way of thinking about plans is the SMART goals, which I think is fundamentally useful. A SMART goal is something that is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So let's say, for example, that you're trying to prepare an application to a university like Oxford. Well, work out your time limitations. Let's say you've got 2 weeks, right? So there's your time bound. Work out something specific that is going to make an improvement in your competitiveness. Try and work out what that needs to be. So I've made a lot of videos in this regard, but reach out and communicate with people if you need some help. They might, for example, say, as they likely will, that admissions tests are one of the best predictors of performance in Oxford undergraduate admissions. So that is perhaps going to have the greatest impact. If you've got 2 weeks, the greatest specific impact on your application is going to be preparing for an admissions test. Something measurable would be, right, well, I've got 2 weeks, I've got specifically to improve my results on an admissions test, I've got these 4 past papers, I'm going to improve my performance in increment in each past paper, so that's measurable. It's achievable as well, provided you don't have too many other commitments in those 2 weeks, and it's relevant because it's going to help you out in a specific goal that you're aiming towards. Once you've set these things out in quite a clear and reasonable plan, then you're much more likely to execute that plan, and you're much more likely to see the fruits of that plan as well. The problem is, if we just sort of vaguely aspire to doing a bit more, we won't do it. Or we'll set some sort of outrageously ambitious plans that again won't be realisable, and we'll just be annoyed at ourselves for not having attained them. And that's also not going to help your mood and your self-esteem. Okay, so those were my 5 study skill tips. I do teach them either explicitly or implicitly to all of my Oxford undergraduates. I do genuinely think that these are not only good skills for improving your academic performance and improving your competitiveness in university applications, but I genuinely, hand on heart, think these skills have changed my life. They've helped me solve problems in my life. If you have any questions about anything that I've raised, do feel free to email me. My email address is on the screen now. I'll be happy to help either with this or with any admissions queries you have about the University of Oxford. And if I can't help, I'll pass your message along to the people that can. Remember also that a crucial thing about thinking is that it's not just a solo venture. I mean, of course, we only have, as individuals, our own minds to occupy us for most of the time. But the whole point of a university is that it's a community of people that come together and share ideas. And hence why I'm happy to help you, because I know that I couldn't have made it to a university like Oxford without help, and I know that literally all of my students are in exactly the same position. So don't feel like this is a battle that you have to wage on your own. You need help, and you're welcome to have it, so do please get in touch. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been of some help. Do get in touch. I wish you all the best. Thanks. Bye now.